what I thought I'd do for the next hour is really just see if I can elicit some, almost like a theory of change, at base, a little bit of a sense of what it is that makes resilience as a frame of reference, especially an ecological model of reference, helpful to communities to actually change things. And, you know, again, probably the best way is to perhaps just sort of start with an example. And the example I wanted to sort of present to you was this really simple program up in northern Canada. And it's called Angel's Nest. Now, what it is imagine this. You're in a place called Whitehorse, which is bitterly cold most of the year, right? And they have a problem of street children, street youth, homeless youth. Now, that in itself is quite remarkable if you think about trying to be a homeless youth in like subarctic conditions. These are hardy street youth. I don't mean to make light of it, but I mean there's a lot of kids from very chaotic and disadvantaged circumstances, and they end up drifting around. Sometimes they go to school, sometimes they don't. This very forward-thinking woman, who's really without any professional training, had realized this problem in her community. She was a single mother, she didn't have much training in this field, but she kind of said, I'm going to make a difference here. And she set up this safe space for young people to drift to in the afternoons. And this is what got kind of interesting. She worked with local bar owners. So she actually worked with some of the local businesses in the downtown core of the city who had a vested interest in getting these kids serviced as well, because basically they weren't, you know, they were getting into trouble and stuff in the community. And they got a bar owner to loan her to one of these big steel round huts that they have in the north. And she set it up as a drop-in center for young people. And she gets about 75 young people in a city of about 30,000 people, or not even, sorry, no, 15,000 people. She gets about 75 to 100 kids a day showing up. And the draw to this service is that they get a hot meal, a 3-course hot meal, in which people make donations of food and everything else, and she cooks them a really nice hot meal, which brings them in. They get social supports, they get access to computers, they can get tutoring help. There's a small sort of micro business built into this thing that does screen printing. They have artistic studios within this little place. But mostly they get a connection with some caring adults, some safety and some security, and they're off the streets. Now here's the interesting part. That's nice, isn't it? Here's the interesting part. All the other service providers in Whitehorse began to get a clue that, wow, we have all these kids gathered. All the highest risk kids are gathered in one place. So what are we going to do? We're going to swarm down there. Oh yeah, the public health nurses and the social workers and the AIDS prevention workers and the drug and alcohol counselors. Wow, we've got a captive audience, 100 high-risk kids. Wow, we're just going to go down and service these kids. And Vicky, who runs this place, her name is Vicky Durant, and she stands at the door to this hut. And I've watched her do this and basically say to the professionals, all the PhDs and MAs and MSWs and MPs and all that, you can't come in. We don't need you. We don't need psychologists. We don't want PhDs in this and that. We don't want public health folks. Go away. This is a space for the kids. But what we do need is cooks. Now, if you want to come in and cook, that's a whole nother thing altogether. And she had this right indignant PhD psychology once say to her, excuse me, I'm a psychologist, I don't cook. To which she responded, well then fine, you don't come in. And of course what happened over time was all the people with the letters after their name began to come to this facility and cook 3-course meals. And the magic of the thing was, of course, that the kids knew that this was a public health nurse, that this was a psychologist specializing in trauma therapies. And slowly the kids who were in crisis or needed help began to sort of trust these people who were mixing the meatball sauce, you know, to actually engage with them. Now this is a model that is not random. Though Vicky, I think, hit it, kind of like hit the jackpot in a you know, a lucky draw that she got it all right. But the point is that what I'm inspired by is programs that begin to think about the complex sets of needs and deliver them in ways that are tailored to children's vulnerabilities. She created many of the foundation stones for resilience: safety, supports, cultural continuity, a sense of belonging, connections with an adult. Don't we always talk about that stuff? But the devil is in the details of how you actually do it. There's a guy in Philadelphia who's quite famous for working with adults with developmental challenges and people with acquired brain injuries and these kinds of populations of very vulnerable adults. And he says that quite often our paradigms get all screwed up. We offer people individualized therapies when what we really should be offering them is something quite different, because let's face it, the roots of mental health are clearly in other aspects of people's lives than just individualized therapies. And let me give you, his name is Dalhousie, very interesting man. And he says, having worked years and years and years in this field, that he says what people basically need is a friend, a home, a ride, and a job. Isn't that neat? He says basically that what we all need for mental well-being is a friend, a home, a ride, and a job. And when communities fail to provide people with those, then they need advanced interventions and specialized treatment and shelters for homeless people and all the rest of the things. So what I'm beginning to understand, see, I get a chance to sort of go around the world and look at aspects of how communities have actually giving young people mostly opportunities to be more resilient. Angel's Nest is one of the examples I saw, which I kind of got inspired by, because here was a very sort of grassroots initiative that was actually creating the safety, security, and psychological space for children to actually thrive in some pretty harsh and neglectful conditions. Especially, by the way, 99% of the children who come into that center are Aboriginal, First Nations, Native Canadians, whichever word you prefer to use. Now, when I go around the world to places like all of these different places around the globe, what we see clearly is that there's some commonalities in what children are looking for. And this is a little bit why I want to sort of set the stage for talking about the actual program interventions. Because whether or not I'm in, I don't know, a place like Tanzania, or if I took you to, I could take you to Jerusalem, I could also take you to southern Florida, maybe Ireland, let's go to South Africa, Palestine, maybe we'll go up to China. I could actually take you to even Halifax, where I'm from. There's a common set of themes that appear when you have vulnerable children. And what I'm beginning to understand then is that resilience is our ability to respond to their needs. Now, what I'm going to suggest that really resilience, I know there's lots of different definitions, but what I do know is it's not just about what's inside of us. As I said yesterday, it's also about how we facilitate our access to things. And I've basically been thinking that resilience is, in the context of adversity, because let's face it, that's what we're talking about, resilience, right? We're talking about when adversity strikes. It seems to be our capacity to navigate and negotiate for the resources we need to do well. Now, I'm a little more practical in my application. I'm a social worker by training, so I'm trying to get this down to some actual implications for service. And for me, the implication is I need to design services. I'm going to make people resilient, quote unquote. If I'm going to make them resilient, I need to help them navigate to what they need, and I need to help them negotiate for what they need. Now let's think about those two terms, if I could, just very simple. Because I'm actually quite simple in my thinking. If I can get an idea to crystallize in my brain very concretely, I can usually figure out what the solution is. So what I've been trying to say, okay, so what is resilience? Look, I just need to help people navigate to what they need. And by navigation, of course, what I'm saying is not only, right, is it about their own personal willingness to navigate. I mean, there's an element of, I have to get up in the morning and say, I want something better for my life. Sure. But you know what? If you stick in front of people accessible things like Angel's Nest in the high Arctic of Canada, and you provide them with a three-course meal and someone to actually say their name and greet them and a safe place to be, motivation sort of is inconsequential. People drift. They navigate to what's available and accessible to them when we get it right. And then there's an element here also of negotiation, isn't there? That we want programs to, in a sense, respond to communities' needs, which is what Vicki Durant, standing at the door, said to all those professionals, you are not what these kids asked for. Go away. What these kids asked for was computers and food and a safe place to be. Oh, I know that if we actually stick you in front of them, if I stick a trauma therapist in front of them, if I stick a public health nurse in front of them, yes, they will use you. But it has to be more on their terms. So there's a kind of constant negotiation back and forth. And what in fact I'm seeing clearly around the world is that what we see young people doing is navigating and negotiating for 9 different things. And these are consistent across all the populations around the globe that we keep saying. This is kind of what we're seeing. And they're foundational to designing good programs. So, but let me just very quickly say, look, kids seem to be looking for structure and consequences. Even kids in jail. All kids seem to really thrive when they know that there's some predictable limits on their behaviors and expectations on them. We also know that children need parent and child connections, but that is so overstated. So I think what we need to do is we need to understand that sometimes when families are really under crisis, we come in as helpers and we have this mythic notion it has to be mom or dad that repairs the child. When in fact what we're actually finding is that's not true. Studies of resilience all over the globe are saying actually something quite different. What they're saying is that when mom and dad are stressed, mentally ill, addicted, immigrants, feeling marginalized, whatever the issue, in fact, it's the broader networks of extended kin, community, tribal group, community, clergy, church, mosque, synagogue, whatever, you begin to sort of expand schools, social workers, community safety nets, that all those other relationships become incredibly powerful means by which people become resilient. We also see that good resilience seems to result from people experiencing a powerful identity. In other words, that's that, okay, John Travolta strut, right? That sort of, I'm 51, right? So okay, work with me on this. John Travolta, Saturday Night Fever, right? That's that wonderful scene where he's kind of walking down the street after he's prinked himself up. He's got the white suit on and the Bee Gees music, whatever, behind him, and he's kind of walking down. The only way that Travolta has that beautiful sort of strut, kind of fully embodied, I am the center of the universe, kind of, he's kind of walking like that. Well, that's what you want for people, right? You want every child to experience that, obviously in a culturally relevant way. And of course, we give them that. That's not something that comes from inside. Why would you walk down the street? Travolta didn't do that walking down the street. He walked to the club and then he danced. There was a celebration of who he was performing as. We give kids that. That's what's so essential. We also, very important to have a sense of control, appears a lot. That's an obvious one, an efficacy, the ability to change your world. We also see around the world a sense that there's got to be this sense of belonging, a sense of my culture, maybe spirituality, a connection to a religious group if you prefer. Whatever the child's pathway is, that they know that when they get up in the morning that there's a purpose to their life. There's also a need for their rights to be respected, and as well a sense that they have responsibility for others, that somebody is relying on them. And of course, basic safety and support as well. Now, if I was a Cirque du Soleil act, if I could run away at the circus and juggle 9 balls in the air, that would be the image I'd want to leave you with, because in a sense what kids tell us is they are better when programs, interventions, social supports, their communities help them to find all 9 of those things in some combination together. Of course, the challenge for us in developing services, supports, whatever, is what's our theory of change? What are you trying to do when you develop a program? And if I could, how many of these is your program actually addressing? That seems to be the challenge. So if I'm going to design a community-based intervention like Angel's Nest in the high Arctic, then I'm going to know I hit the magic. The magic is there if I can say, wow, Vicki, you seem to be getting these kids involved in a lot of these different aspects of their life. She provides them structure, and there are consequences when they screw up in the shelter, in this kind of drop-in center, right? They have responsibilities to help with the cooking. They have responsibilities to keep the place safe for others. You kind of go through the same sort of matrix. So my challenge then is, how do we create, with intentionality, resilience promoting projects that I'm going to argue, from my work around the globe, get at as many of these things as possible. And people like Dalhousie or others would sort of basically say the same thing. if I can continue this conversation, then of course the challenge then says, okay, so if I'm going to set up if I'm going to establish a community-based program, usually there's a problem that I'm trying to solve. Now I know it's been set by Big Lotto that it's somewhat the problem of social and emotional learning. So that's great. Then what's your target population? And more specifically, what exactly is your desired outcome? I do believe that if we're talking about resilience, we're talking about populations somewhat under stress. And I understand that the communities that were chosen in part because they have populations under stress. So, and then the problem is going to be obviously what's ever relevant. In the high Arctic in Whitehorse, it was 100 street kids. That was the problem that got to be solved. Now I understand that people will define this in different ways, but this is for me. I'm going to go from a theory that I have a theory of change, which is very clear. I know the kinds of factors I want to embellish through my resilience promoting work, and then I want to say, okay, which problem do I want to address, and who's the target population, and what is my desired outcome? Now I know it sounds very simple, but I'm amazed by how complicated it gets when you actually have to make the programs work. So, I realized from yesterday that what we were really talking about was this tension in the room between universal programs and targeted programs, right? So, which population? Are you only targeting the kids most under stress, or are you targeting the kids across an entire school district for, who have a cohort exposure to adversity? Which is it? By the way, I'm not sure that Big Lotto is necessarily saying, unless I missed it, that you want to necessarily be a program for all children regardless of risk exposure. Now maybe that's the ultimate goal, but that's going to be quite a different set of outcomes, a different focus of programs, right? Because if you include, okay, I have a couple of kids, right? If you include my kids in the same intervention as the kids who are using the shelter in Whitehorse, well, that's quite a range of experience. My kids, I mean, if they don't come home from a meal, or they don't get a hot meal this evening, it's because they didn't choose to come home. It was being offered, right? There's a whole nother set of dynamics that are playing out in a family, and I will say, like mine, where there is a fairly, a financial stability, a certain amount of emotional supports, a continuity of care, structure and consequences, and all that kind of stuff, right? There's a difference here. Now, so let me just think about some universal programs, and then let me also think about some targeted programs, and then think about ones that are joint. So, there are some great universal programs which have been very effective with populations under stress. In Canada, we have one called Stop Now and Plan. It's a program for all elementary school kids, and what it does is it's a cognitive therapy taught across a group of children. It can be adapted into school environments, and it's really about giving children the tools to reflect on their behavior and to basically control. There's mindfulness programs that do much the same. There's a whole bunch of sort of streams of these programs. But the idea really is saying to kids, look, kids can be very impulsive, violent, they can get themselves into trouble, and this program, with an evidence base, goes in and basically says, hey, look, we can train all kids to decrease their impulsivity and their violence and actually create safer schools and safer communities. And it basically can work. There's also things like, for universal programs, whole school approaches to bullying. All these people are basically saying, if you want to address bullying, don't do the one-off workshops. Oh, and they actually, well, those little tiny mini workshops for 12 weeks in which you talk about bullying, they actually increase bullying in schools, eh? You know that? That's the research. Very clearly, it increases bullying. But if you go into a school and create a whole school shift in culture, and you integrate it with the parents and messages across the community, and you create safety and security, and you make the school a holistic holding environment, generally speaking, you can address bullying. I also love there's a program that had as an objective in Calgary, Alberta in Canada, that had as an objective to make it better for children to interact with the police and avoid problems where children were suspicious or not willing to report crimes or sexual or physical abuse to the police. The police were perceived as very intimidating. So again, the problem they said was, we want to make kids more resilient by making police officers a bigger support in their life. And what they did was they put uniformed police officers in the elementary school, not doing policing work, but instead teaching those courses on moral character that government minister yesterday talked about. They actually teach courses on character and stuff like that, but they use the police to do it in conjunction with the elementary school teacher together in front of the classroom. And then the cops go out in uniform and play soccer or football or whatever with the kids, and they're integrated. And then their hope is, and it's actually showing results, is that you've created a shift in culture in the community so that police are not perceived as sort of an assaultive force in your life, but they're actually a part of the network of supports and weave of people that can actually help you when you're in crisis. They're approachable, they're human beings beneath that uniform. Isn't that neat? So you get these kinds of communities have identified a problem, they've had a theory of change, and they've gone out and said, you know, looking at many of those 9 things I just talked about, they've really said, hey, we can actually adapt. Now, there are more targeted programs as well, of course. Things like, and this is one of my, we were actually the evaluators on one of these programs called the Youth Advocate Program, and I hinted at it yesterday, but the Youth Advocate Program works with children about 9 to 14, age 15 approximately, to try and get them to not drift into gangs. And the way it did that was they identified, essentially, they went into communities and identified the very highest risk kids. And they said, we know that these kids are not going to necessarily do well in life. And they intensely provided one-on-one supports to these kids. Now here's the interesting thing. When the program was originally designed, it was supposed to be that they were going to try and put more professional supports in, like masters trained professionals to work with these kids, except they didn't have enough money to do it. So they ended up hiring paraprofessionals largely from the same communities that the kids come from. Now this is interesting. The downside of that is that when these paraprofessionals tried to hold case conferences to bring together all the networks of supports, the professionals with all the degrees behind their names refused to meet with a paraprofessional. Because a paraprofessional doesn't have enough clout to call the psychiatrist to a meeting, right? So unless the psychiatrist gets called to the meeting by somebody who has enough letters after their name to merit the call back, they don't come to the meeting. But interestingly, those paraprofessionals clevered on to an interesting idea that what they would do is they would have case conferences in series. They'd go and meet the psychiatrist, and then they'd carry the message forward like a traveling troubadour and meet with the social worker, and then they'd go and meet with the parents, and then they would meet with the kids, and then they would meet back with the school principal. They said, well, if you ain't going to come to us, we're going to go to you. The other thing which was unintended but amazing was that the parents who hated professionals with letters after their names loved the paraprofessionals because they weren't as intimidating. They spoke in the same way. They were often culturally or ethnically of the same groups as the parents. And the parents were much more open to these workers entering their lives, even though they had long histories of burnout with people with credentials like mine. Interesting serendipity of understanding what a community needed and targeting a very difficult group of kids to engage with and actually providing them with 24-hour round-the-clock supports. If these kids were screwing up at 10 o'clock at night, they could call their primary worker. The worker would come out, enter the family because they had permission to enter the families. And if the kid was screwing up during the day at school, the school would call the worker and the kid got the support in the school and prevented a suspension or an expulsion from the school. Isn't that neat? That is that kind of saying, wow, okay, this is a targeted program. Now, I could keep going on. Let me just give you one other completely different example. I have a whole bunch here, but when I was in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia just recently, they have a major problem, of course, with the disengagement of Aboriginal youth from schools. Huge dropout rates. One of the things that they've done in the junior highs as part of a comprehensive strategy of trying to get young people, young Aboriginal kids, to come and stay in school, is they have instituted language training for all grade 8 students in the Aboriginal language of the region. Now this is interesting, think about it, right? Because the Aboriginal kids are often the ones who are most disadvantaged in terms of academics. So what they do is, for one period a day, for 8 weeks, in grade 7, I mean, how many of you all went through grade 7? Do you remember how pleasant an experience that was? No. It was a hellish experience, right? Nobody likes grade 7. No offense to grade 7 teachers, but nobody likes grade 7, right? And they do it right at that point in life. And they give a language class in the Aboriginal languages. So who do you think shines in those classes? The Aboriginal kids. Who do you think screws up in those classes? The white kids, or the ones with the advantages, right? It completely turns the tables and gives in a concrete way a sense of inclusion of a very marginalized group within the community. Now, that alone is not enough to change anyone's life. But when you combine that with then the opportunity for the kids who want to continue their language training, they can do that. And it also shifts the culture in the school to be much more inclusive of all races and all classes and all peoples. Isn't that neat? Then you begin to get a real kick in terms of outcomes. Now, sometimes there are universal and targeted interventions. For instance, an adaptation of that Stop Now and Plan program that I mentioned has been to actually target the needs of girls who are specifically from very disadvantaged contexts. So what they've done is they've actually adapted the Stop Now and Plan program in Canada to work with girls from very challenging homes. And they've added to it a component, not only in the schools, but they've also added a component of it for the parents. And they've done it in a very sort of collaborative way as well. You know, it's interesting, you see around the world these efforts to very much shift that focus in places like I was part of a large project in Medellin, Colombia, which was for a time the most violent place on earth, right? Medellin, with home to Pablo Escobar. In fact, I don't know, a little tidbit of knowledge, but Medellin was so violent during the 1990s and early millennium that they'd actually set up a hospital right next to the airport in Medellin where you could go and get organ transplants. You could literally fly in, just taxi about less than a kilometer, go get your organ transplants and leave. Because there was such an incredible availability of young men's bodies where they could harvest organs from. And this is the scale of the violence there. And they've managed to actually adapt that by entering their programs that targeted attitudes in schools and making school classrooms less punitive in their punishment and discipline strategies. But they didn't just stop there. They also went out into communities and started working with families where there was a strong culture of violence as well. So they worked with the families, they worked with communities, they did all kinds of other initiatives across the community to signal that violence was not okay. They also did more policing and other things like that, and they addressed the crime and everything else. But it was a comprehensive strategy from the child to the family to the community and the school. And they got results. The crime rate in Medellin has dropped by almost 90%. It's 10% of what it was a decade ago. I mean, so it is possible to make these dramatic shifts. Let me give you one last example. I'm going to just open it up. Another program which I really love is an example called Pathways to Education. Basically what they do is there was a group of parents living in subsidized housing units in Toronto at the time. And this group of sort of well-to-do, you know, nice-thinking community developers went out to a place called Regent Park, and they said to the community, how can we help? We want to, you know, there's crime and violence and drugs and poverty and cycles and, you know, fourth generation people living on welfare. And so how can we help? And they thought that the community was going to say, who knows what the community was going to say, make it safer, put in a grocery store, address our eating, I don't know, whatever. And you know what the community said to them? Could you just get our kids through high school? And they said, well, we're community developers, not educators. And we said, well, we don't give a crap. You came to us, asked for us what we need. We said we want to get our kids through high school. Do it. So that's where they put their money. They've developed this amazing initiative that provides a cohort of all grade 9s, so the kids about 14, 15 years old. And what they get is they get tutoring for free. They get a liaison person who helps network the family and the community and the school, like sort of like an advocate. They also get a mentor for the child, someone from the community who can inspire them to be better. And every child gets $1,000 bursary for every year of high school that they complete. So by the time they finish high school in grade 12, so they've gone through 4 years of the program, they have 4,000 Canadian dollars in a bank account, a trust fund, that they can use for post-secondary education. It has dramatically increased the rate of high school completion. And it's the kind of holistic thinking models that fire on so many of those aspects of resilience and has been evaluated and proven to actually be effective. So, I hope I'm being concrete enough. But I'm moving from my theory of change. I know clearly what my population of interest is, and I'm very clear that those 9 things that the theory of resilience says will need to be shifted, almost every one of those examples I've given has, in some way, large or small, tried to hit as many of those 9 factors as possible. Thank you very much.